Professor M.B. Rajeev Gowda.
Thank you, Deputy Chairman, sir. Sir, it is an appropriate day for us to be discussing the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill. Today, November 20th, is observed worldwide as the Transgender Day of Remembrance, in memory of all those who have been murdered as a result of transphobia and people's biases against the transgender community. This is a community that continues to face challenges and violent attacks in the face of their expression of their own sexual identity. It is an appropriate day for us to correct these injustices, and therefore discussing this bill and taking it forward would be a wonderful gesture and a meaningful gesture towards the transgender community, which has historic role in India. So I was also present and actively participated 4 years ago when this House, very, very historic occasion, passed the private member bill unanimously. This was piloted by Tiruchi Shivaji, my colleague, and the bill that was passed there was extremely beneficial and protective of the rights of transgender persons. We have tried very hard to ensure that this bill that has been brought by the government also reflects many of those features, but many of them continue to be missing, which is why Sri Shiva has moved this amendment to send it to the Select Committee. So, I want to lay out a few key issues that affect this bill and which really I would urge the Minister to find a way to correct. So, the first point is that this contradicts the Nalsa judgment. So, the Supreme Court, in a very historic judgment, the court in a very historic judgment in the Nalsa case, state and central governments were asked to extend reservations to trans people and intersex people in education and public employment. The minister is the Minister for Social Welfare. But we still see that in spite of the court directing central and state governments to take steps to treat the transgender community as socially and economically backward class, this current bill does not address that issue in any way, and that is a lacuna. This is a community that is deserving of that status, and there is a judgment to support that. So, the same Nalsa judgment also lays down what is called the right to self-identification. It states that trans persons must be able to self-identify irrespective of whether someone has undergone a medical procedure or not, and there must be no mandatory requirement of a mental health assessment or a medical diagnosis for gender recognition. It is in people's minds that their gender identity is discovered, is expressed, and it is not necessarily something that has a physical dimension, and that is something that the bill must respect. Instead, sir, its section 6(1) of the bill states, the district magistrate shall issue to the applicant under section 5 a certificate of identity as transgender person after following such procedure and in such form and manner within such time as may be prescribed, indicating the gender of such person as transgender. So, this bill then, because this procedure is not laid out, essentially contradicts what the court's judgment is all about and can create more trouble and more difficulties for people who want to get protection of their rights under this particular situation. It essentially reflects my second point, which is that there's a very narrow understanding of the concept of gender here, sir. The section 12(3) of the bill basically reflects the understanding of gender as a psychiatric issue. It goes ahead and places transgender people in rehabilitation centers under the orders of a competent court if their parents are unable to provide shelter. This is a general problem faced by transgender children, transgender persons, that they do not find a welcoming home in many circumstances and have to go and seek refuge with others of the community. So this violates the agency of people to be able to live freely. This is a right granted by the Constitution, and it is also supported by the Nalsa judgment. And gender should not be turned into something that requires rehabilitation and psychiatric evaluation. So I would urge the minister and the government to revisit the bill and expand the scope of the definition and understanding of gender and not confine it to just biology. So I have moved an amendment to delete this provision. So the third point is non-separation of gender non-conforming children from their parents and family. So bill originally provided that no transgender person should be separated or to be separated from their parents or family owing to their transgender identity except on court's order. The amended bill that's with us here in clause 12 now seeks to limit it to a transgender child and not person pursuant to the recommendation of the Standing Committee, para 5.15. So I've moved an amendment to replace the term children with persons and to also add the right to inherit property as per existing laws on inheritance and devolution of property. People may discover their sexual identity when they are no longer children as defined by the definition of the law. And then they may face the problem of being thrown out of their parental home. That's the reason why by bringing children here and restricting the protection of those rights, we are doing an injustice to many people who may be affected. So my fourth point is that there's no grievance redressal mechanism for discrimination. So the Standing Committee pointed out that there has been no definition of discrimination in the bill, and without a definition of discrimination for the purpose of this act or law, it would be almost impossible to prohibit the same by the appropriate government. So what is discrimination in this context? We need to spell that out. So I have gone ahead and proposed an amendment which spells this out. And then when we accept the amendment, which I urge the House to and the Minister to accept, then we will be in a position to look for actual violations and provide redressal. So I'll just read out that amendment because it's relevant here. Discrimination means any distinction, exclusion, disability, liability, condition, or restriction on the basis of gender identity and expression, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others, with all others, of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field, and includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. So we have offered a very constructive amendment which spells out what discrimination stands for and on what basis one can get redressal. And this is something that the Standing Committee had noted that was missing in the bill, and I would urge the Minister and the Government and the House to accept that amendment. So the last major point is that establishments have no real obligation to prohibit discrimination against transgender persons. Clauses 9 to 12 of the bill provide an obligation of establishments, whether government or private, to ensure that no transgender person is discriminated in any manner relating to employment, and to provide for the setting up of a complaint officer in every establishment. But there's no mechanism that would make these establishments comply with the law. If there is, we know that transgender persons have a tremendous challenge in getting jobs, getting employment, and then retaining that employment. But if they face discrimination there, we in private or government settings, where is the redressal? And for that, all that the law asks these establishments to do is to establish a complaint officer. But what are the functions of that complaint officer? What actions should they be taking? And how would they respond to a complaint of discrimination? None of this is spelled out. I hope the rules will do it. And, but basically, that is another lacuna. So overall, I must urge the government, the House, when it suggests amendments, when we pass a private member bill, and the late Sri Arun Jaitley made sure at that time that the entire House backed that bill unanimously, that there is the collective wisdom of the House which supported the Transgender Rights Bill. And there are many provisions in there that should have found their way into this law. This law is a little restrictive in its concept of what transgenders are, what is transgender, what are their challenges, what are the ways in which they can enforce their rights, which are their due as equal citizens under law. And therefore, I would urge the government to reconsider its stand and let this bill go to the select committee where all these issues can be ironed out, and then we can pass this unanimously once a revised bill is brought. On this day, or Transgender Day of Remembrance, let us once again honor all those who have fallen victim to violence because of their sexual identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor M.B. Rajeev Gowda ji.